Hello, I'm James Cridland from Pod News, and you're listening to Into the Podverse with Tony Doe.
Podcasting pioneer and Pod News editor James Cridland joins me on Into the Podverse to dissect the evolution of podcasting and peer into its future. James shares his first-hand experiences and predictions for the future, including the potential impact of video on the podcast industry, the symbiotic relationship between radio and podcasting, and the importance of multi-skilling in content creation. Welcome to Into the Podverse with your host, Tony Doe. This is where innovation meets storytelling and challenges transform into opportunities. So join me, Tony Doe, on an auditory journey that unveils the secrets of this burgeoning medium. Uncover the hidden gems of podcasting from my perspective and with exclusive interviews from the masters of the Podverse. James, you've been deeply involved in the evolution of audio media for over 3 decades. How have you seen the landscape change, particularly in terms of podcasting, from your early days to now?
I think that the landscape has changed an awful lot. I actually wrote an RSS feed back in March of 2005. Well, that's when we launched it. We actually wrote it in January of 2005. That was before Apple had got involved in podcasting. That was before there was an image tag in podcasting for a thumbnail. So it's clearly rather more mainstream these days. Many more people, of course, are in podcasting. But I think what I'm excited about in terms of podcasting is that there are still lots of independent podcasters. There are still lots of people like me who can make a podcast in their slightly echoey office and get that published on the same platform as people like Joe Rogan and Trevor Noah and all of those types of people. So I think from a point of view of how it has changed, I think, of course, things have changed. But I think it's certainly just as exciting as it always has been.
Your role as editor of Pod News gives you a unique insight into the trends and developments within the podcasting industry. But what are some of the most notable shifts or emerging trends you've observed recently?
I think there are a few things that I've spotted. I mean, firstly, podcasting is probably overheated in the US last year, but it didn't overheat elsewhere. Other countries are catching up with consumption. Only the other week I was covering something in the Pod News newsletter about the most excited countries about, listening to podcasts, the countries that listen the most. And I think South Africa was number 2 or number 3. I think it was a tremendously high figure. Not necessarily sure that I entirely believe that number, but I think, there's an awful lot of catching up. Which is happening across the rest of the world, which is nice to see. As a Brit, somebody who lives in Australia, that's also nice to see too. I think also the excitement about video as well. What can you do with video? What then do you call a podcast? All that kind of stuff is fascinating too. And I am really interested to see whether video takes our industry into the next level, or whether video essentially ruins the industry as we know it. And I don't think anybody knows yet.
With your extensive experience in both radio and podcasting, how do you perceive the relationship between these two mediums evolving, especially as podcasts gain more prominence in mainstream media consumption?
Yeah, well, the relationship between radio and podcasting, I remember going to the first podcasting conference in London, which was, I think, in June or July in 2005. And I turn up from the national radio station saying, hello, I'm here. I'm going to tell you what we're doing in the podcast space. And I was actually shouted at by the folks at the conference, partially because it was commercial and we were taking commercials on the shows that we were doing, but also partially because we were big media and we shouldn't have been in that space. And you don't know what you're doing, I think one person said, and it was quite a scary thing. That said, I think that radio is now working together. I think we are better at working together and understanding what each side wants in terms of radio than we've ever been. And I think from that point of view, that's been a really useful, helpful thing in terms of where radio, is going. I mean, you only have to look at iHeart in the States, getting very much into podcasting, apparently the number one podcaster in the world, global in the UK, here in Australia, ARN and SCA, as well as the ABC, of course. And I think, there's a bunch of that kind of stuff going on. So I think the relationship is a pretty good one now. And I think both sides, both radio and podcasting, have a lot to teach each other.
You've been involved in various projects across different continents. Have you noticed any significant differences in how podcasting is approached or consumed in various regions? And if so, what do you think drives these differences?
Oh, there are tremendous differences in different regions. And in fact, in a couple of weeks' time, towards the end of May, I will be talking at the podcast show in London. And one of the things I'll be unveiling is some data that I have that show podcast consumption in different countries. And as a little exclusive, one of the things that I discover is that in Mexico, for example, 90% of people who listen to podcasts are listening to them on Spotify. 90%. And that figure is about 45% in the US, slightly higher in some European countries, but 90% in Mexico. Tremendous. I think also you can see that there are certain countries in the world, Korea being one of them, India being another one, where the big podcast apps that we use, Spotify and Apple Podcasts, of course, aren't used really very much in those areas. And local podcast apps are used much, much more. And I think that's another big difference in terms of different, differences in different countries. I think thirdly, I think it's pretty easy to see a undeveloped podcast market by having a look at the charts for that particular market, and the Spotify charts are a little bit more close in terms of consumption than the Apple charts because of the way that they are made. And you can see very much in some of these countries, particularly in some countries in Southeast Asia, that there's an awful lot of catch-up radio in the top 10 shows. And to me, that shows a developing market, one that hasn't yet grown to have a lot of independent podcasts, a lot of what the French call native podcasts made for podcasting rather than podcasts that are reheated radio shows. And so I think it's interesting looking at different markets and going, how developed are you? How much reheated radio do you have in that top 10?
As a radio futurologist, you've likely thought deeply about the future trajectory of audio media. Where do you see podcasting heading in the next 5 to 10 years? And what factors do you believe will shape its evolution?
I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see podcast audience continuing to grow, but I do also think that we are beginning to plateau in terms of the amount of people listening to podcasts. And I think for me, the most important thing over the next 5 years is time spent listening to podcasts. It's not something that we do very well in terms of measuring, but I think we should be measuring it more. And time spent listening is much more important. The longer that people listen to podcasts, bluntly, the more money we can make. That's a fairly stark thing, but if people listen twice as long, then we can sell twice as many ads and we can earn twice as much money. So I think actually that's a much more important thing, and I think that time spent listening is going to grow and continue to grow. So I think that that's a good thing. Otherwise, I think, in terms of podcasting over the next 5 to 10 years, I think we'll just see more growth, more mainstream stuff. And in certain, in certain demographics, particularly younger demographics, I think that we'll see podcasting being more popular than radio. It isn't yet, but I think it will be pretty soon, within the next couple of years. So that's certainly something to have a look for.
Your work has spanned from pioneering streaming radio apps to advising modern podcast hosts. What are some common challenges or misconceptions you've encountered among newcomers to the podcasting scene, and how do you address them?
I think there are a couple of very common misconceptions that I see new people in podcasting, and whether that's a new hobby podcaster on the side, or whether that's a new big commercial company that jumps into this space. It's interesting how little they understand about how podcasting actually works and how audio files get to podcast apps. They're not published to individual podcast apps like Apple and Pocket Casts. They are pulled by Apple and Pocket Casts and Spotify and everybody else from your podcast host. That's how it works. So you find a lot of people going, you haven't sent my file yet to Apple Podcasts. Well, no, Apple Podcasts hasn't asked for your file yet. That's how the thing works. So I think just some education there is very helpful. I think the other mistake that people make is that audio, they think, is easy to make. And it's not. Audio is really hard to make well. It's really hard to make successfully. It's really hard to make so that it works really well as a piece of standalone media. I think that large podcasters can sometimes make it feel a little, effortless, really easy, really simple to put a podcast together. I think that people assume that it must be easy and simple to put it together, and it really isn't. It's a lot of hard work, and I think that that's one mistake that people make.
Collaboration and partnerships seem to be increasingly vital in the podcasting industry. Could you share any experiences or insights into successful collaborations you've been a part of and what you think makes them effective?
I think one of my favourite podcasts of all time was a collaboration, the BBC working with NRK, the Norwegian public service broadcaster, for a great true crime podcast called Death in Ice Valley, which was really cleverly put together with some really clever production techniques in that particular show. And I think collaborations are always a good idea. The BBC also working with CBC on a number of different shows, and the CBC has also done some collaboration with Australia's ABC as well. And I think, it's always good when you get lots of clever, creative people in one room together, sharing things that they have learnt from their own employer, from their own company, and understanding how to move forward. And I think we're certainly seeing now, large podcast companies working together quite well with other podcast companies now. And again, that sharing of ideas going through. The other piece of collaboration and partnerships is actually the stuff which is happening in the new world of podcasting, in Podcasting 2.0. Additional services, additional features that can be put into podcast apps and to be used by podcast aggregators. That is very much a collaboration. That's very much a partnership between technologists and people in the industry, and I find it fascinating to watch how that is all taking off as well.
As an organizer of radio and podcasting conferences, you have a finger on the pulse of industry discourse. What are some key topics or discussions you anticipate will be prominent in the upcoming conferences? And why do you think they're important?
Look, I think, to be honest, every conference is the same. Consumption, production, monetization. That's what every single podcast conference talks about. The secret sauce is finding really good speakers, and finding people who can actually help you move forward as an audience member. And not all podcast conferences do a fantastic job of that. But of course, video, is a wider thing. That's an important thing. And understanding how to produce something that works really well in terms of audio as well as video, or video as well as audio. That's a thing that, frankly, I don't see talked about an awful lot at podcasting conferences and indeed at radio conferences. And I'm hoping to see much more of that this year and next year.
Hybrid radio technology, which you've been involved in through Radio DNS, represents an intersection between traditional broadcasting and digital innovation. How do you see technologies like hybrid radio shaping the future of audio consumption, particularly in regions where both radio and podcasting are becoming more prevalent?
Do you know, I have to be honest, I don't think that hybrid radio will shape the future of audio consumption. What hybrid radio is it's a way to join the internet and FM or DAB broadcasting and make both work better together. So it gives you big changes in a car, for example. If all of a sudden your car knows where to find more information about that particular radio station, where the logo is, where the electronic program guide is, where the now playing information is, all of a sudden it can give you a much more rich experience, but also how to keep listening when the FM signal goes away. Because cars are mobile, that's kind of how cars work. So I think, hybrid radio is great for that. Will it make differences in terms of audio consumption? Probably not. Will it safeguard how radio is consumed in a car? Probably. And, radio is still the bastion of the car. And I think we will see big changes in car and how we listen to radio in cars, and podcasting is still very, very small. One of the challenges I think that the podcast industry has is to make podcasting grow in cars. And I think cars specifically, podcasting is very difficult to control with voice. Podcasting is frankly quite difficult to control, on a car screen. So I think it's going to be really interesting seeing how different companies rise to that particular challenge, because there's certainly something quite exciting in terms of how in-car actually works in terms of podcast consumption.
As someone who's made a significant impact in the field of audio media, what advice would you give to aspiring podcasters or individuals looking to make their mark in this industry, especially from your unique perspective of having traversed both radio and podcasting?
I think I would give two bits of advice. Well, in fact, one bit of advice. I think that the advice that I would give is multi-skilling. That's the important thing. Learn to do everything. I think the age of the specialist is over and the age of the generalist is upon us. So if you were to look at Pod News, for example, the newsletter that I write every single day, I can code. So I can code the website and I can code the information which is there. I can write, at least I hope I can, so I can actually write the newsletter. I can produce the audio as well, because it goes out as audio as well. I can research, I understand how RSS feeds and all of that kind of stuff. That's super helpful in that, essentially the Pod News newsletter is all of my generalities all put together in terms of one thing. So I think that multi-skilling is a very important thing. I think also, learning to automate, learning to get rid of as much non-creative stuff. If you are a creative person, I think working out how you can work on that workflow to produce self-sustainable creativity, which you can do in the time allotted to you, I think is really important. And that means getting rid of the stuff which isn't creative, getting rid of the stuff which doesn't give you much returns. So that's the other probable piece of research or piece of advice that I would actually give somebody.
Thank you for coming on the show, James.
It's been a pleasure to have me on. Thank you so much, Tony. I appreciate it.
Into the Podverse is brought to you by Tony Doe Media and is produced by yours truly. It's available everywhere you get your podcasts, and do be sure to leave us a complimentary note via the links in the description. May the Pod Force be with you.